The Coast Guard station in Key West received the distress call at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday that would forever change how maritime investigators approach survivor testimonies. The voice on the radio was barely human, a rasping, broken whisper that spoke of waves the size of mountains and a darkness that swallowed everything whole. But it wasn't the dramatic rescue or the miraculous survival that would haunt the investigators for years to come. It was the realization that every single word the survivor spoke was a carefully constructed lie, and the truth buried beneath it was far more terrifying than any storm could ever be. This is not just another tale of survival against impossible odds. This is the story of how one man's desperation to hide the truth about what really happened aboard the sailing vessel Meridian's Dream led to one of the most elaborate deceptions in maritime history. What we're about to uncover will challenge everything you think you know about human nature under extreme circumstances, and it will reveal how sometimes the most dangerous enemy on the open ocean isn't the weather, the waves, or mechanical failure. It's the person standing right beside you. The investigation that followed would take 2 years to complete, involve forensic experts from 3 countries, and ultimately expose a web of lies so intricate that even the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit called it masterful in its psychological manipulation. By the time you finish hearing this story, you'll understand why maritime law was quietly changed to prevent anything like this from ever happening again, and why the lone survivor's name is still whispered in sailing communities as a cautionary tale about the darkest corners of the human soul. But to understand the magnitude of the deception, we need to start at the beginning, with 2 people whose shared dream of sailing around the world would become a nightmare that only one of them would live to lie about. Marcus Whitfield was the kind of man who measured success in nautical miles and sunset photographs. At 51, he had spent the better part of 2 decades climbing the corporate ladder at a Boston-based marine insurance company, a job that paid well, but slowly crushed his spirit with each passing year of fluorescent lights and conference room meetings. His corner office overlooked Boston Harbor, and on clear days, he could watch the sailboats cutting through the waves like white-winged promises of freedom. It was during one of those moments, staring out at the harbor while reviewing yet another claim for a damaged yacht, that Marcus made the decision that would ultimately cost him everything. The decision wasn't sudden. It had been building for years like pressure in a steam valve. His marriage to Sarah had ended amicably 3 years earlier, a mutual acknowledgement that they had grown into different people who wanted different things from life. She wanted stability, predictability, a retirement plan that made sense on paper. Marcus wanted to disappear over the horizon and find out what lay beyond it. The divorce settlement left him with enough money to make a clean break, and at 51, he figured he had maybe 15 good years left to chase the dream that had been gnawing at him since he was a teenager, reading sailing magazines in his father's garage. The yacht he chose was a 42-foot island packet named Meridian's Dream, a name that would prove prophetic in the most sinister way imaginable. She was built in 1998, meticulously maintained by her previous owner, and designed specifically for long-distance cruising. Marcus spent 6 months going over every inch of her hull, every line in her rigging, every component of her electrical and plumbing systems. He replaced the standing rigging, upgraded the electronics, and installed a new diesel engine with low hours. The boat was his obsession, his monastery, his escape pod from a life that had felt increasingly meaningless with each passing day. But Marcus knew he couldn't make the journey alone, not because he lacked the sailing skills, but because he craved the human connection that only comes from sharing an extraordinary experience with another person. He had considered asking old friends, former colleagues, even his ex-wife, but none of them understood the pull of the open ocean the way he did. That's when he placed the ad on sailing forums and crew-finding websites. Experienced sailor seeks adventurous companion for circumnavigation aboard well-equipped yacht. Must be physically fit, mentally stable, and ready for the journey of a lifetime. The responses came in by the dozens. Young backpackers looking for free passage, retired couples wanting to relive their youth, experienced sailors between jobs. But it was Elena Vasquez's response that stood out from all the others. Her email was articulate, detailed, and refreshingly honest about both her strengths and limitations. She was 38, a former trauma nurse from San Diego who had burned out after 15 years of emergency rooms and had spent the last 2 years sailing the Pacific coast, living aboard a modest 28-foot sloop and working temporary nursing jobs to fund her wandering lifestyle. What impressed Marcus most was Elena's approach to risk management. Her nursing background had given her an almost clinical understanding of how things could go wrong and how to prepare for them. She was certified in wilderness first aid, had extensive experience with marine electronics and diesel engines, and had already completed 2 major ocean crossings, one from San Francisco to Hawaii and another from San Diego to Cabo San Lucas. More importantly, she understood the psychological challenges of long-distance sailing, the way isolation and stress could turn small personality conflicts into major problems. When they met in person at a marina in Newport, Rhode Island, Marcus knew immediately that Elena would be his sailing partner. She was compact and athletic, with weathered hands that spoke of years spent handling lines and working with tools. Her dark hair was streaked with premature gray, and her brown eyes held the particular kind of confidence that comes from having faced real danger and survived it. She asked intelligent questions about the boat's systems, studied the charts Marcus had laid out, and demonstrated a practical knowledge of ocean sailing that impressed even his experienced eye. They spent 3 days together on Meridian's Dream, sailing in and around Narragansett Bay, testing their compatibility as crew members and getting to know each other's sailing styles. Elena was methodical and safety conscious, always double-checking Marcus's work and asking what-if questions that showed she was thinking several steps ahead. Marcus was more intuitive, trusting his instincts and experience to guide him through challenging situations. They complemented each other perfectly, and by the end of the 3rd day, they had shaken hands on an agreement that would take them around the world together. The plan they developed was ambitious but realistic. They would depart from Newport in early October, taking advantage of favorable weather patterns to make their way south to the Caribbean. After spending the hurricane season exploring the Lesser Antilles, they would transit the Panama Canal and begin the long Pacific crossing, island hopping across the South Pacific before reaching New Zealand by the following March. From there, they would continue west across the Indian Ocean, round the Cape of Good Hope, and return to the Atlantic for the final leg home. The entire journey was expected to take approximately 18 months, with flexibility built in for weather delays, mechanical issues, and the simple human need to stop and explore the places that called to them along the way. Marcus invested nearly $40,000 in additional safety equipment, navigation electronics, and emergency supplies. They carried 2 life rafts, multiple EPIRB beacons, a satellite phone, and enough emergency food and water to last 60 days. The boat was equipped with radar, GPS chart plotters, weather routing software, and communication equipment that would allow them to stay in touch with the outside world and receive weather updates anywhere on the planet. Every system had a backup, and most backups had backups of their own. Elena contributed her own expertise and $25,000 toward expenses, money she had saved during her years of living simply and working steadily. More importantly, she brought a level of practical experience that perfectly complemented Marcus's more theoretical knowledge. She had dealt with medical emergencies in remote locations, understood the psychological stress of extended isolation, and had the kind of mechanical aptitude that could mean the difference between a minor inconvenience and a life-threatening emergency. The departure from Newport on October 12th was everything Marcus had imagined it would be. The weather was perfect, 15-knot winds from the northwest, clear skies, and a forecast that showed stable conditions for at least the next 5 days. Elena had insisted on a formal safety briefing before they cleared the harbor, going over emergency procedures, abandoned ship protocols, and the location of every piece of safety equipment on board. Marcus found her attention to detail slightly obsessive, but he appreciated her thoroughness and recognized that her nursing background had trained her to prepare for worst-case scenarios. The first month of the voyage exceeded every expectation Marcus had harbored during his years of dreaming about blue water sailing. They made excellent time down the coast, averaging over 100 miles per day and reaching the Bahamas in just 8 days. The boat performed flawlessly, the weather cooperated, and Marcus and Elena settled into a comfortable routine of 4-hour watches that allowed them to keep the boat moving 24 hours a day while ensuring that both of them got adequate rest. Elena proved to be everything Marcus had hoped for in a sailing partner. She was competent without being overbearing, adventurous without being reckless, and possessed the kind of steady temperament that remained calm under pressure. when they encountered their first real weather challenge, a late-season tropical storm that forced them to heave to for 36 hours, while 40-knot winds and 12-foot seas battered the boat. Eleanor's experience and unflappable demeanor helped Marcus maintain his confidence in both the boat and their decision to make the journey. The Caribbean leg of their voyage was everything the sailing magazines had promised and more. They explored hidden anchorages in the Virgin Islands, dove on pristine reefs in the Grenadines, and spent lazy afternoons in the cockpit reading books and planning the next phase of their journey. Marcus felt like he had finally found the life he was meant to live, and Elena seemed to share his enthusiasm for their floating lifestyle. They developed the kind of easy companionship that only comes from shared challenges and mutual respect. And Marcus began to think of Elena not just as a sailing partner, but as a genuine friend whose presence made every aspect of the journey more enjoyable. It was in Granada, while they were preparing for the transit to Panama, that Marcus first noticed the subtle changes in Elena's behavior that would eventually lead to the events that destroyed everything they had built together. The changes were small at first. She became more particular about her personal space, more protective of her belongings, and slightly less willing to discuss their long-term plans for the Pacific crossing. Marcus attributed these changes to the natural stress of preparing for the most challenging phase of their voyage, but looking back, he would recognize them as the first warning signs of something much more dangerous brewing beneath the surface of their partnership. The passage from Granada to Panama took 12 days. And it was during those 12 days that Marcus began to understand that Elena was not the person she had presented herself to be during their months of preparation and their early weeks at sea. The changes in her behavior became more pronounced as they got further from land and deeper into the isolation that defines ocean sailing. She became secretive about her communications on the satellite phone, claiming to be calling friends and family, but always moving to the forward cabin for privacy, and speaking in hushed tones that made it impossible for Marcus to overhear even fragments of her conversations. More troubling was the way Eleanor began to challenge Marcus's decisions about navigation, weather routing, and daily routines aboard the boat. She had always been methodical and safety conscious, but now her suggestions carried an edge of criticism that hadn't been there before. She questioned his choice of anchorages, his interpretation of weather forecasts, and his management of the boat's systems. What had once felt like collaborative decision-making began to feel like a constant low-level conflict over who was really in charge of their shared destiny. Marcus tried to address these issues directly, but Elena deflected his concerns with explanations that seemed reasonable on the surface, but didn't quite ring true. She claimed the stress of ocean sailing was affecting her sleep patterns, making her more irritable than usual. She explained her secretive phone calls as conversations with an ex-boyfriend who was dealing with personal problems and needed her emotional support. She attributed her criticism of Marcus's decisions to her growing understanding of the boat's systems and her desire to contribute more meaningfully to their navigation and safety procedures. But it was the incident with the engine that first made Marcus wonder if Elena might be actively sabotaging their voyage. They were motoring through the flat calms that sometimes plague the Caribbean when the engine suddenly began running rough, coughing and sputtering before finally shutting down completely. Marcus immediately suspected water in the fuel, a common problem in the tropics where condensation can accumulate in fuel tanks. But when he opened the engine compartment to begin diagnosing the problem, he found something that made his blood run cold. The fuel filter housing had been loosened just enough to allow water to enter the fuel system, but not enough to cause an obvious leak. It was the kind of sabotage that required specific knowledge of diesel engines and a deliberate intent to cause problems without making it obvious that the damage had been inflicted intentionally. Marcus stared at the loose fittings for several long minutes, trying to convince himself that they could have worked loose naturally through engine vibration and the boat's constant motion. But he had checked every connection in the engine compartment just 3 days earlier, and he knew with absolute certainty that the fittings had been tight at that time. When Marcus confronted Elena about the engine problem, she expressed appropriate concern and offered to help with the repairs. Her reaction seemed genuine, and her mechanical knowledge proved invaluable in getting the engine running again. But Marcus noticed that she avoided looking directly at him while they worked, and he caught her watching him with an expression that seemed almost calculating when she thought he wasn't paying attention. By the time they had the engine running smoothly again, Marcus had made a decision that would ultimately save his life. He would never again leave Elena alone in the engine compartment, and he would quietly begin documenting anything unusual about the boat's systems or Elena's behavior. The Panama Canal transit went smoothly, and Marcus hoped that reaching the Pacific would mark a fresh start for their partnership. The mechanical problems had been resolved. Elena seemed to be in better spirits, and they were finally beginning the Pacific crossing that represented the heart of their circumnavigation dream. But as they cleared the Panama Canal and began their passage toward the Galapagos Islands, Marcus realized that whatever was troubling Elena had not been left behind in the Caribbean. If anything, her behavior became even more erratic as they sailed west into the vast emptiness of the Pacific Ocean. It was during the passage to the Galapagos that Elena made the first direct threat against Marcus's life, though at the time he interpreted it as nothing more than a stress-induced moment of poor judgment. They had been sailing for 6 days in light winds, making slower progress than expected and falling behind their planned schedule. Elena had been complaining about their slow pace and suggesting more aggressive sail choices that Marcus felt were inappropriate for the conditions. When Marcus refused to set the spinnaker in what he considered to be marginal conditions, Elena exploded in a rage that seemed completely disproportionate to the situation. "You're going to get us both killed with your conservative bullshit," she screamed, her face flushed with an anger that seemed to come from somewhere much deeper than frustration with their sailing progress. "I should have known better than to trust my life to someone who's too scared to make the hard decisions when they need to be made." The outburst lasted only a few minutes, but it revealed a side of Elena that Marcus had never seen before. Her anger wasn't just about sailing decisions. It carried undertones of resentment and something that felt almost like hatred. When she calmed down, Elena apologized profusely, claiming that the stress of ocean sailing was affecting her more than she had expected. She blamed her outburst on homesickness, worry about friends back home, and the natural anxiety that comes with being hundreds of miles from the nearest land. Marcus accepted her apology, but he also began to sleep more lightly and to pay closer attention to Elena's movements during his off-watch periods. He started keeping a detailed log of unusual incidents, mechanical problems, and Elena's mood changes. What he discovered over the following weeks was a pattern of behavior that suggested Elena was not just struggling with the stress of ocean sailing. She was actively working to undermine their voyage and possibly to harm Marcus himself. The evidence accumulated slowly, but it was unmistakable once Marcus began looking for it. Tools would disappear from their designated locations and turn up in Elena's personal gear. Critical spare parts would be moved from the engine room to places where they couldn't be found quickly in an emergency. Navigation equipment would be subtly miscalibrated, creating small errors that could accumulate into major problems over long passages. Most troubling of all, medications from the boat's medical kit began to disappear. Not the obvious painkillers or antibiotics that someone might take for legitimate health issues, but drugs like sedatives and heart medications that had no legitimate use aboard a healthy sailing vessel. The psychological warfare was even more insidious than the physical sabotage. Elena began a campaign of subtle undermining that was designed to make Marcus question his own judgment and competence. She would contradict his navigation decisions, then claim to have no memory of the conversation when the results proved Marcus had been correct. She would offer to take responsibility for critical tasks, then complete them in ways that created problems while maintaining plausible deniability about her intentions. She began keeping irregular watch schedules, claiming insomnia, and offering to take extra time on deck. But Marcus realized she was using these periods to access parts of the boat that were normally off-limits during his watch periods. The breaking point came during their approach to the Marquesas Islands, when Marcus discovered that Elena had been systematically tampering with their emergency equipment. Life jacket inflators had been punctured in ways that wouldn't be obvious until they were needed. Emergency flares had been opened and their charges removed. Most chilling of all, one of their 2 EPIR beacons had been damaged in a way that would prevent it from transmitting their location in case of emergency. Marcus confronted Elena with the evidence of sabotage, but she denied everything with a conviction that was almost believable. She suggested that the equipment failures were the result of the harsh marine environment, normal wear and tear that Marcus was misinterpreting because of the stress and paranoia that sometimes affect sailors on long passages. She pointed out that Marcus had been acting increasingly suspicious and withdrawn, suggesting that his accusations were symptoms of the psychological breakdown that sometimes occurs during extended periods of isolation. But Marcus knew what he had seen, and he made a decision that Elena would later use to justify the unthinkable. He told Elena that their partnership was over and that he would put her ashore in the Marquesas with enough money to fly home from Tahiti. He explained that he no longer felt safe sailing with her and that he intended to complete the circumnavigation alone. Elena accepted his decision with a calmness that should have warned Marcus of what was coming, but at the time, he was simply relieved that she hadn't fought him on what could have been an ugly confrontation. They made landfall in Nuku Hiva on a Tuesday morning in March, after what had been the most stressful passage of Marcus's sailing career. The island was everything the guidebooks had promised, a dramatic volcanic landscape rising straight from crystal clear water with lush green valleys and waterfalls tumbling down 1,000-foot cliffs. Under different circumstances, Marcus would have been thrilled to explore such an exotic destination. But all he wanted now was to see Eleanor safely off his boat and out of his life. Eleanor seemed to share his eagerness to end their partnership. She packed her belongings quickly and efficiently, taking only her personal gear and leaving behind the equipment and supplies she had contributed to their joint venture. She was polite but distant, treating Marcus more like a taxi driver than someone who had been her closest companion for the past 6 months. She arranged her own accommodation ashore and booked her own flights home, refusing Marcus's offers of financial assistance with an independence that he found both admirable and slightly suspicious. On Thursday evening, Elena invited Marcus to join her for a farewell dinner at a small restaurant overlooking the harbor. Marcus was reluctant to accept, given the tension that had characterized their final weeks together, but Elena insisted that she wanted to end their partnership on a positive note. She seemed like her old self again, friendly, articulate, and genuinely apologetic for the problems that had developed between them. She claimed that the stress of ocean sailing had revealed aspects of her personality that she didn't like, and she expressed gratitude for Marcus's patience and understanding during what had been a difficult time for both of them. The dinner was pleasant, almost nostalgic, as Elena shared memories of their early days together and the magical moments they had experienced in the Caribbean. She ordered a bottle of expensive French wine and toasted their successful completion of the first phase of the circumnavigation. Marcus found himself remembering why he had chosen Elena as his sailing partner in the first place, and he began to wonder if he had misinterpreted her recent behavior. Perhaps she really had been struggling with the psychological challenges of ocean sailing, and perhaps his own stress and paranoia had made him see malicious intent where none existed. It was the wine that saved Marcus's life, though he wouldn't realize it until much later. Elena had somehow managed to drug his food with a powerful sedative, probably one of the medications that had disappeared from the boat's medical kit. But the alcohol in his system counteracted enough of the drug's effect to keep him conscious when Eleanor's plan required him to be completely unconscious. As they walked back toward the dinghy that would take them to Meridian's dream, Marcus began to feel dizzy and disoriented, but he attributed the symptoms to too much wine and the emotional exhaustion of ending their partnership. Elena helped him into the dinghy and started the outboard motor, steering them toward the anchorage where Meridian's dream waited in the darkness. Marcus dozed fitfully during the short ride, fighting waves of nausea and a growing sense that something was terribly wrong. When Elena helped him climb aboard the boat, her hands lingered on his arms longer than necessary, and Marcus caught her studying his face with an intensity that made him deeply uncomfortable. She helped him down to his cabin and suggested that he get some sleep, claiming that she would finish securing the dinghy and preparing the boat for his departure the following morning. Marcus collapsed onto his bunk fully clothed, too disoriented to properly undress or brush his teeth. As consciousness slipped away, he heard Elena moving around the boat, opening lockers and drawers with a purposefulness that didn't match her claim of simple housekeeping tasks. Marcus woke in darkness to the sound of water rushing into the boat's hull somewhere near the bow. His head was pounding, his mouth was dry, and it took several seconds for him to remember where he was and what was happening. When full consciousness returned, he realized immediately that Meridian's dream was sinking and that Elena was nowhere to be seen. The boat was listing heavily to starboard, and the sound of water entering the hull was getting louder with each passing moment. Marcus stumbled out of his cabin and made his way forward, following the sound of the rushing water. What he found in the forward compartment made him understand, with crystal clarity, exactly what Elena had been planning all along. The through-hull valve that provided water for the forward head had been opened completely, allowing seawater to pour into the boat at a rate that would sink her within an hour. But the valve had been sabotaged in a way that made it impossible to close. The handle had been removed, and the valve stem had been damaged so that it could only remain in the fully open position. Marcus realized that Elena had planned to drug him unconscious and then sink the boat with him trapped below. She would have taken the life raft and the emergency supplies, leaving Marcus to go down with Meridian's dream in what would appear to be a tragic accident. She could claim that Marcus had been drinking heavily, that he had fallen and hit his head, and that she had been unable to save both him and herself when the boat began sinking unexpectedly. But Eleanor had made one critical mistake in her calculations. She had assumed that the drug would keep Marcus unconscious long enough for the boat to sink completely. Instead, he had awakened with just enough time to understand what was happening and to fight for his life. The boat was settling rapidly by the bow, but she hadn't yet reached the point of no return. Marcus had perhaps 30 minutes to save himself before Meridian's dream slipped beneath the surface and took him with her. Marcus's sailing experience and Elena's nursing training had taught him to think clearly under pressure, and he immediately began implementing the emergency procedures they had rehearsed during their months together. He activated both EPIR beacons, or rather, he tried to activate both of them. The primary beacon functioned normally, immediately beginning to transmit his position to rescue satellites, but the backup beacon was completely dead, confirming Marcus's earlier suspicions about Eleanor's sabotage. The life raft presented another problem. Elena had taken the primary raft, leaving only the smaller backup raft that was designed for coastal sailing rather than open ocean survival. Marcus deployed the raft and began transferring emergency supplies from the sinking boat, but he quickly realized that Elena had been systematically removing critical items from their emergency stores. The backup water maker was missing. Most of the emergency food supplies were gone, and the medical kit had been stripped of everything except basic first aid supplies. As Marcus worked frantically to save what he could from the sinking boat, he began to understand the full scope of Eleanor's deception. This wasn't a crime of passion or a plan that had developed during their voyage. It was a carefully orchestrated murder scheme that had been months in the making. Elena had joined the voyage with the specific intention of killing Marcus and stealing Meridian's dream, and she had spent their entire time together preparing for this moment. The boat's final moments were both terrifying and strangely beautiful. Meridian's dream settled by the bow until her deck was awash, then rolled slowly to starboard as water filled her interior spaces. Marcus watched from his life raft as his floating home, his escape from the conventional world, and his ticket to the adventure he had dreamed about for decades slipped beneath the black water of the Pacific Ocean. The last thing to disappear was the wind vane at the top of her mainmast, a small silhouette against the star-filled sky that vanished without even a bubble to mark the spot where she had been. Marcus spent the next 4 days drifting in the life raft, rationing his limited water supplies and trying to understand how Elena's plan had gone so wrong that he was still alive to tell the story. He replayed every conversation, every incident, every moment of suspicious behavior, looking for clues he had missed and warning signs he should have heeded. What troubled him most was the realization that Elena had never intended for him to survive long enough to expose her crimes, which meant that her plan had included provisions for disposing of his body and covering up evidence of murder. The rescue came on the 4th day, when a French naval patrol vessel spotted his life raft approximately 40 miles northeast of Nuku-Hiva. Marcus was dehydrated, sunburned, and mentally exhausted, but physically unharmed and coherent enough to give a detailed account of what had happened. He told the rescuers that his sailing partner had taken the primary life raft and emergency supplies after the boat began sinking, and that he had last seen her heading towards Nuku-Hiva in what he assumed was an attempt to summon help. But when the French authorities checked with the marina and hotels on Nuku-Hiva, they discovered that Elena Vasquez had never returned from her final evening aboard Meridian's Dream. Her belongings were still in her hotel room. Her flight home had been missed, and there was no record of her having contacted local authorities or requested rescue assistance. It was as if she had simply vanished into the night, taking with her the answers to questions that would haunt Marcus for years to come. The investigation that followed was thorough, but ultimately inconclusive. French maritime authorities, working with the US, Coast Guard and FBI, conducted extensive searches for both Elena and the missing life raft. They interviewed everyone who had come into contact with Marcus and Elena during their stay in Nuku-Hiva, analyzed the boat's insurance policies and Marcus's financial records, and even brought in psychological profilers to assess the likelihood that Marcus was lying about the circumstances of the sinking. What they discovered was a woman who had never existed in the way she had presented herself to Marcus. Elena Vasquez was indeed a real person, a trauma nurse from San Diego who had owned a 28-foot sailboat and had completed several ocean passages. But the real Elena Vasquez had been murdered in her Marina del Rey apartment 3 months before she was supposed to meet Marcus in Newport. The woman who had sailed with Marcus for 6 months, who had shared his bed and his dreams and his deepest fears about the voyage, was someone else entirely. Someone who had stolen Elena's identity along with her sailing resume and her plans to circumnavigate the globe. The FBI's investigation revealed that the imposter had done extensive research on Marcus before responding to his crew-finding advertisement. She knew about his divorce settlement, his insurance coverage, and his plans for the circumnavigation. She had studied sailing and navigation intensively, enough to convince Marcus that she was an experienced sailor. But her real expertise lay in psychological manipulation and long-term planning for financial crimes. The motive became clear when investigators discovered that Marcus had designated Elena as the beneficiary of his life insurance policy and had given her power of attorney to handle his financial affairs while they were sailing. If Marcus had died as planned, Elena would have inherited nearly $2 million in insurance proceeds and retirement accounts, along with ownership of Meridian's Dream and all the expensive equipment aboard her. It was a sophisticated crime that would have worked perfectly if not for the counteractive effect of alcohol on the sedative she had used to drug Marcus. But the most chilling discovery came when investigators found Elena's laptop computer in her hotel room on Nuku-Hiva. The hard drive contained detailed plans for Marcus's murder, including diagrams of the boat's through-hull fittings, research on sedative drugs and their effects, and contingency plans for disposing of Marcus's body if the sinking scenario didn't work as intended. She had been planning to kill Marcus from the moment she responded to his advertisement, and she had spent months earning his trust while preparing for his murder. The laptop also revealed that Elena had been in contact with criminal associates throughout the voyage, sending regular updates on their position and progress via encrypted email messages. She was part of a larger organization that specialized in identity theft and insurance fraud, targeting wealthy individuals who were planning extended travel in remote areas where murders could be disguised as accidents and bodies might never be recovered. Marcus returned to the United States a changed man, emotionally shattered by the betrayal and psychologically traumatized by his narrow escape from a carefully planned murder. The insurance company paid his claim for the loss of Meridian's Dream, but the money couldn't restore his faith in human nature or his enthusiasm for the sailing life that had once meant everything to him. He sold his replacement boat within a year and never again set foot on the deck of a sailing vessel. The woman who had called herself Elena Vasquez was never found, despite an international manhunt that continued for more than 2 years. She had vanished as completely as if the Pacific Ocean had swallowed her, along with the lies she had told and the life she had tried to steal. Some investigators theorized that she had been picked up by a prearranged boat and had escaped to a country without extradition treaties. Others believed that her criminal associates had eliminated her to prevent her from exposing their organization. Marcus preferred to believe that she had met the same fate she had planned for him, alone and afraid in a life raft, watching the horizon for rescue ships that would never come. The case officially remains open, though active investigation ceased after the trail went cold in the waters around French Polynesia. Marcus occasionally receives calls from law enforcement agencies when similar crimes surface in other parts of the world, but the woman who destroyed his dreams and nearly took his life has never been seen again. She exists now only in police files, FBI databases, and the nightmares of a man who learned too late that the most dangerous predators in the ocean sometimes look exactly like the people you trust most. The story of Meridian's dream became legendary in the sailing community, whispered around marina bars and yacht club gatherings as a cautionary tale about the risks of sailing with strangers. Maritime law was quietly amended to require more extensive background checks for crew members on international voyages, and insurance companies began requiring additional verification procedures for policies covering extended cruising. But for Marcus Whitfield, the changes in maritime law and insurance procedures were cold comfort for the loss of everything he had worked toward for decades. He had dreamed of sailing around the world and discovering what lay beyond the horizon. Instead, he had discovered that the greatest dangers on the ocean aren't storms or mechanical failures or navigational errors. They're the monsters who disguise themselves as fellow dreamers and wait patiently for the perfect moment to reveal their true nature. The woman who called herself Elena Vasquez had been the perfect sailing partner right up until the moment she tried to murder him. She had been competent, experienced, and trustworthy in every way that mattered for ocean sailing. But she had also been a predator who understood that the isolation and vulnerability of long-distance cruising created perfect opportunities for crimes that might never be detected or investigated. Marcus's survival was due to nothing more than a fortunate accident, the interaction between alcohol and sedatives that kept him conscious when Elena's plan required him to be helpless. If he had drunk less wine at dinner, or if Elena had used a different drug, or if he had been a lighter sleeper, Meridian's dream would have taken him to the bottom with her, and Elena would have collected $2 million for a perfectly executed murder. The realization that his life had been saved by pure chance, rather than by skill, or preparation, or divine intervention, haunted Marcus more than any other aspect of his experience. He had spent months preparing for every conceivable emergency that might occur during their circumnavigation. Storms, equipment failures, medical emergencies, navigational problems. But he had never considered the possibility that his greatest threat would come from the person sharing his watch schedule and sleeping in the cabin next to his. Today, Marcus lives quietly in a small coastal town in Maine, working as a marine surveyor and trying to rebuild his life one day at a time. He rarely talks about his experience aboard Meridian's dream, and he has never again attempted any form of long-distance sailing. The ocean that once called to him with promises of freedom and adventure now represents only betrayal and the memory of how close he came to dying alone and afraid in the darkness. But sometimes, on clear nights when the moon is full and the harbor is calm, Marcus walks down to the water's edge and stares out at the horizon, remembering what it felt like to believe that anything was possible if you were brave enough to sail toward it. He remembers the weight of the wheel in his hands, the sound of water rushing along the hull, and the sight of Meridian's dream's bow cutting through the waves like a promise of tomorrow. And sometimes, in those moments of remembering, Marcus allows himself to wonder what would have happened if Elena had been who she claimed to be. If their partnership had been built on trust rather than deception, if they had completed their circumnavigation together and returned home with stories of adventure instead of survival. But these moments never last long, because Marcus has learned that some dreams are too dangerous to pursue, and some horizons are better left unexplored. The ocean keeps its secrets, and somewhere in the vast emptiness of the Pacific, the truth about what happened to the woman who called herself Elena Vasquez lies buried beneath miles of dark water. Marcus will never know whether she escaped to live another life under another stolen identity, or whether the sea finally claimed her as payment for the dreams she destroyed and the trust she violated.